For our first panel, we are so excited to bring to you 4 states that have really transformed their early childhood systems. I had an opportunity to interview them, and I asked them to address why their state chose to prioritize investments in infants and toddlers, and to describe what they've done to transform their systems and the goals that they hope to achieve, the successes that they've had thus far, and the challenges that they've faced, and any insights that they would provide to other state leaders who are considering similar changes. I spoke with Kayla Hahn, the Chief Policy Officer to Governor Parsons in Missouri, and she discussed the creation of the new Office of Childhood, which consolidated early childhood programs across 3 agencies related to childcare, pre-K, home visiting, early intervention, and early childhood workforce supports into a single office. I also spoke with Elizabeth Groginski, the Cabinet Secretary of New Mexico's new Early Childhood Education and Care Department, along with her colleagues, Giovanna Archuleta, the Assistant Secretary for Native American Early Childhood Education and Care, and Janice Gonzalez, the Chief Health Officer of the new department. The department is the 4th cabinet-level state early childhood department in the country. Additionally, I had a wonderful conversation with Jenna Conway, the Deputy Superintendent of Virginia's Early Childhood Care and Education Division. The division just moved from the Department of Social Services to the Department of Education to ensure that children who are using child care subsidies are in high-quality programs that lead to good outcomes. And finally, I spoke with Council Member Robert White from the District of Columbia. He worked alongside a group of council members to enact the Birth to 3 for All DC Act in 2018. This year, the DC Council made breakthrough progress by approving a budget that includes a 3% tax on DC's highest earners to provide nearly $75 million in local annual funding for the Birth to 3 law. We invite you to watch and learn more about how these states are thinking systematically to improve opportunities and outcomes for infants and toddlers. What they've accomplished is truly impressive.
I think the first is a long overdue recognition of how important brain development birth to 5 is, and how that has this potential to put kids on track for success, whether that's academic or social emotional or some combination of the two, but realizing that this can have a tremendous impact on kids, on their futures and their success, on families, and on so many of our other systems, from K-12 to our workforce, right? But today's early childhood population is tomorrow's workforce. The second is this fundamental understanding, and also a long overdue recognition, that this is intentional learning and development, that early childhood is not a handout, is not babysitting, is not working simply to keep kids from harm, but is fundamentally, whether you're thinking about infants or toddlers, preschoolers, these are professionals who are working to support kids' learning and development.
We collectively understood the importance of the prenatal to 3 years in terms of development of children, lifelong achievement, health impacts, economic impacts. But we also understood the need for parents who need to get back to work and be a part of the workforce. So we have seen study after study that talks about the economic impacts of birth to 3 learning, the health impacts, the impacts on families, most importantly mothers, because they are usually the ones making the professional sacrifice to stay at home because of that cost burden of early childhood education, but also centers being able to survive and sustain and keep staff, and so they can professionalize.
Early childhood, we believe, is critical to workforce because if they're safe, if they're healthy, if they have educational opportunities early, we know that investments in early childhood have a very positive return long term. We knew that we were ranked 45 in early childhood governance by the Bipartisan Policy Center. That was also a sign to us that we may need to do something differently.
The stark reality of 50th in child well-being, which is where we were until last year, we're now 49th, and the 49th in child poverty are two very impressive, staggering statistics that I think have motivated this legislature and clearly our governor to say we've got to double, triple down. We've got to invest in what we know works. And I give so much credit to this state for recognizing the research that says if we invest early with high quality programs and services that are aligned and do support families, we can change this trajectory.
And we know that adverse experiences in early childhood can affect learning and interpersonal relationships and can cause chronic illness. So we already know in that sense that there's a connection, and that we need to look at health in a holistic way, not just physical health, but developmental health, mental health, and relational health.
The creation of the Early Childhood Education and Care Department was a 10-year process. It was something that came about, I think, because legislators, advocates, parents, providers all recognize the need to have a better and stronger coordinated system for prenatal to 5. And it was Governor Lujan Grisham who was able to get it across the finish line because she had a cradle to career vision for New Mexico. And she knew that investments in the early years were absolutely essential and critical to the success of this cradle to career movement. Our Lieutenant Governor, Howie Morales, when he was in the Senate, was the first to bring the first iteration of what has now become the department bill. And he saw it really as a call to action because there had been a significant lapse of federal funds at the department that handled childcare. And he didn't see it as a blame or somebody did something, but just recognizing again that issue that when you have such an important program embedded in larger departments, the ability to keep your eye on all the balls and make sure everything is going well was a challenge. And so he kind of used that as an impetus to say, we need better alignment. We need to bring these programs and services together. Thanks to, again, the legislature passed the Land Grant Permanent Fund. It now goes to the votes of the people in November 22 to say, do the people of New Mexico want to take a small portion of the Land Grant Permanent Fund and invest that in early education? So these are 3 really important steps, 1 year after the next. I love that the governor said, we can't just create the department, we have to make sure we fund the work. Because while there was funding available, it was not enough to really change the trajectory. So she created the Early Childhood Trust Fund and worked with 2 key legislators to get that passed. I think it was unanimous, passed, and $300 million.
We were working with so many different agencies. We had 3 different agencies all working on either childcare or home visiting programs or social service programming for our kids. We also had all three agencies, Health and Senior Services, Social Services, and our Department of Elementary and Secondary Education all had home visiting programs. Several of our stakeholders and team members in the state kind of coalesced around an idea that had been talked about really for years, which is we need them to be able to access services from one agency. We need our providers to know that they can count on one agency, one office, and remove the fragmentation from our system. Last January, Governor Parson signed an executive order creating an Office of Childhood in our Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. The Office of Childhood brought together 3 state agencies, and it became a consolidation of around 150 employees or state team members into one office. And the size of the budget for the Office of Childhood is just near or around $600 million. And the state of Missouri It's one of our largest offices and divisions now across state government. So bringing those resources together really does show that we are really prioritizing early childhood and childhood programming.
We collaborated and put together and passed the Birth to Three for All DC Act, which became law, and now we have funded a substantial part of it. Birth to Three for All DC is a game changer of a law. It addresses several aspects of the early development stage. So we increase home visits for children and mothers and expecting mothers. We increase salaries for childcare workers, because even though they work in one of the most demanding fields and have to love absolutely what they do, they don't get paid enough to sustain a family themselves. In a place like DC, where we have already universal pre-K, this is a huge thing for families. We already see the payoff from that pre-K investment, and now we're looking forward to seeing the payoff from the 0 to 3 investment.
It's nearly impossible to move the needle on access and quality if you're not even unified in what you're trying to achieve. And so working from this true north of school readiness for all children, saying we've got to increase access, we've got to continually support the strengthening of quality. That means, from the top down, we've got to figure out how do we speak with one voice about health, safety, and learning, and then how do we align the expectations to enable our communities, our early childhood providers, and our families to be successful. And that's, in Virginia, why we have moved everything to the Department of Education so that we can better support our kids and families, our providers, our incredible providers across the state, as well as our communities, to devise the solutions that make the most sense for their kids, families, providers, and educators.
The ultimate goal that we are trying to achieve in DC is universal early childhood education. So when no parent has to pay a second mortgage in order to get their child into an early childhood education program, when every parent can find an open seat in our city that makes them happy, and no parent has to decide, am I going to pay for childcare or am I going to go back to work? That's when we know we will have reached our goal. And we're on the path to it.
The focus of the Office of Childhood would really be one vision, one team, one office, and comprehensive childhood programming. Moving forward, we want to streamline our home visiting programs and make sure that the services that are being offered in our state have some level of coordination and availability to all citizens, regardless of where they live. We want to make sure that there are regional hub offices that can coordinate all of these services for our families in different areas of the state.
At our core, we're focused on making sure that every child in the Commonwealth has the opportunity to come to school ready. And we think of that holistically in terms of some of those early academic skills, literacy and math, but as also those really important social, emotional, or soft skills. We believe in the potential of every child, and yet the adults, right, and the system we have built has failed to achieve that in a fair and equitable way for all Virginians. We know right now that just under half of our kids don't have the opportunity to come to school ready when we look at the Virginia Kindergarten Readiness Program, and all too often things like socioeconomic background, the neighborhood in which you grew up in, other things are predictors when they shouldn't be, where we need to build a system that puts all kids, and I mean all kids, on track for success. So that's our true north. We know that none of this is about a test, though, of kids, that like really what it is about is two things. It's access and making sure that more kids and families have access to high quality experiences. We're so fragmented right now. We have different expectations, hard to work together. Sometimes we end up concerned with turf, right, because of what the different program expectations or the funding resources. And so we realized that we needed to be speaking with one voice at the state level to better support our providers and our communities. by bringing everybody together, inherently, it also forces you to think differently, right? And really, one of the things that goes along with our transition and moving everything together is also saying that we want to come up with a shared vision for what quality looks like and how we continually support improvement over time. It's less of a binary, yes or no, your quality. It's not based simply on a credential or ratio or a health and safety standard. We also understand that children are not autonomous beings, right? They grow up and they learn and they grow in the context of families and neighborhoods and communities. So I think the short answer is we think by building this really important infrastructure, both at the state and I'll talk in a second about the local level, then enables better connections.
We basically have these two systems, right? Early childhood system and the healthcare system that understand this and have similar goals and want to support children and families and help them thrive. But the two systems are not integrated. And not only are they not integrated, they aren't even really connected at this point. So it's more like you have three separate circles where you have the healthcare system in one and the early childhood system in one and the family and child in the middle, right? But it's not connected and it's not being provided to the family in a way that's coordinated. And so that's really our goal, is to try to bring those three circles together, to integrate those two systems, to coordinate the care that we're providing, because we're all touching the same families and the same children.
I want to highlight that the development of the chief health officer position really came out of listening sessions with our tribal partners. Through the needs assessment, we had the Native American Budget and Policy Institute do specific listening sessions. And so we published a separate document called Native American Perspectives. And that was one of their top priorities, was better integration of health and education.
I come from the Pueblo of Nambez, so I get to, really bring my vision, my thoughts, my own lived experience, and my, growing up in a Pueblo to the table. And I think that when we look at our government to government relationships, it is critical that we have those ongoing consultations. It's critical that we meet the vision of each tribe, Pueblo, and nation to support their prenatal to 5 population. And they all have some strong services. It's just coming in and supporting any gaps that they see they may have from our department.
It takes a few years. I've now done it in 2 states, both Louisiana and Virginia. You have to listen to the folks first on the ground, really hear from programs. So in both states, doing listening sessions and getting out there and hearing from our stakeholders, those who are closest to kids and closest to families. It's a lot to move government. And so really thoughtfully making sure you're clear on your true north and why you're doing this, because there's a lot of ways to organize government and nobody gets excited about just moving parts of government. But if there's an overall compelling rationale, you can really get people behind it. And then it just takes the kind of painstaking work of saying, this is a sector that at its core either deserves its own agency or really should be recognized as education, right? These are professional educators. These are not babysitters. These are not workers. Again, regardless of the setting in which you're operating, we need these education professionals to really support learning and growth for our infants and toddlers and preschoolers. And we should organize ourselves in government to support that.
Creating an Office of Childhood certainly came with a set of challenges. Some of our biggest challenges were coordinating 150 team members into a new office, creating a new leadership structure internally, making sure that when this all happened, resources would be ready for providers and families on day one of a transition, making sure that our state budget aligned with the reorganization, making sure that our members in the General Assembly, our families, our provider community, our home visiting entities, making sure that they knew why we're doing this, was also a challenge.
Well, the first challenge we faced was the global pandemic because we weren't even a department yet when the pandemic hit. So that made all of our work, I think, more challenging, but in some ways it really shined a light on the value of having all these programs and services together. I think it was very challenging for the staff who had to move to different departments, move into a different set of cultural norms and help create that in the midst of that pandemic.
And that's another one of the challenges that we have here, is that the programs that we brought together into this department all had different IT systems that they worked off, right? And home visiting and early intervention and families first all had completely different systems. So one of the things that we're definitely working on is a plan to try to better integrate those systems.
There were significant challenges in drafting, passing, and funding the Birth to 3 for All DC bill. The first challenge was trying to figure out how we get these levers right. What is the right pay scale for early childhood educators who are very much like our pre-K teachers in our schools, but not exactly like them? And so what is the right pay scale to implement? That was a big challenge. The other big challenge is, how do I get this issue prioritized above all the other big ideas moving in the city at once? And the way to do that was to make sure we made the case so people understood the impact on families, the impact on the economy, the impact on education, the impact on equity, but also bringing the right people to the table. So not just early childhood education experts, but also economists in our Chamber of Commerce, getting them on board. And then the last piece, which really was difficult, is funding. This is a wildly expensive effort. We are talking about dozens of millions of dollars a year. And Washington, D.C., like every other jurisdiction, has a limited pot of money that we have to make sure we are operating every other aspect of the government at the same time. So getting this funded turned out to be a huge challenge.
I'm happy to report that reorganization went into effect August 30th. We've already made great progress in streamlining our regulations, in bringing together our child care providers under one umbrella, in providing resources and information at one website. So these are all things that really drive at making it easier for providers, for families and kids to access resources.
We're making a big investment in these observations. When we did something similar in Louisiana, I had infant teachers come up and talk to me, and I was expecting them to say, why are you sending people in? Why are you don't trust me? And it was the opposite. They said, I've never had somebody come into my classroom and observe me. I've never had somebody talk to me about anything other than health and safety standards, right? So I worry about all these steps of diapering and I'm worried about messing up here, but nobody's ever come in and say, you do a really good job talking to your babies all day, or you do a really good job of scanning the room and noting when an infant needs your help, right? That's awesome. You do that well. These are your strengths. And here are some areas in which you can improve. And so building a system that measures something, and again, that's not a credential, not a cost factor, but really supports all of our educators, all of their strengths, and all of their opportunities for growth, and then moving the ecosystem around our educators to then focus on individualizing those supports.
The successes so far that make me proud are that, one, we got the car on the road. We were able to create a minor tax to create a dedicated funding for Birth to 3. The other thing that I would say is a success, an early success, no doubt, but hearing from early childhood education operators and teachers about their excitement for the investment in their field. So we all kind of see the future together now, And that's a really exciting thing. There are few tools more powerful than hope. And right now we have a lot of hope.
I think it comes down to the cohesion. I mean, we have all of these programs under one agency where we can communicate clearly. We can have responsive opportunities anytime an issue arises. We can work together. Whereas, when we were separate, it took some time.
We're a seat at the cabinet table. So as issues are being discussed about families' well-being, their self-sufficiency, the health of our communities, the Early Childhood Education and Care Department is sitting there both as a supporter and being able to advocate for the needs of families with young children, but also to listen and hear what are some of the other initiatives and activities that are happening across the cabinet that we can bring to our work. We have heard directly from community members. I'm seeing home visiting and early intervention working so much more closely. I mean, they're sitting down at bureau meeting, division meetings together, talking about opportunities in the community that they're each seeing, and they're able to problem solve together.
There are a couple really important equity goals here. The first is education. In DC, we have a great public school system, but the gap between children of color and white children in our public school system is still incredibly wide. The research shows us that if we do a better job of educating more of our children in the birth to 3 years, when their brains are growing and developing and setting the foundation for the rest of their lives and the rest of their academic careers, we can start to close that gap earlier. But there's also another equity piece here, which is parents who have to make that decision as to whether they have to leave the workforce because they can't afford childcare or can't find it, and those who get to stay in the workforce and grow in their careers. We still see in DC a racial gap between the folks who have to leave their careers and the folks who don't. And so we are closing both of these equity gaps as we create expanded early childhood education opportunities.
Something unique was the creation in our department, though, of an assistant secretary for Native American early education and care, which has been so critical to really changing the trajectory in our state for young children, our Native American children. State level data integration projects, one's called Health and Human Services 2020, and it's about better improving the customer experience so that as they engage with us as health and human service agencies, it's more aligned and streamlined. New Mexico longitudinal data system, which is being led by the higher education department, and we're with the workforce solutions and the public education department. So that's the cradle to career, really able to understand how we're supporting children along the educational trajectory, along the educational pathway. So where we can connect data and understand, hey, we implemented a policy, how can we look at it more quickly to see, are we seeing changes in outcomes? Are we seeing better results? And then the other thing that we're doing as part of our commitment through our statewide strategic plan is we're developing a family survey that we're going to go statewide in multiple languages and multiple modalities to understand if families know about our services. If they do, have they ever used them? And if they have used them, what has their experience been with those programs and services? And so we're hoping to get that issued this year and then use it as an annual opportunity to measure our effectiveness as a prenatal to 5, prenatal to 3 system from a family perspective.
I just don't want us to forget too about spiritual health. I think that is critical in the tribal communities, and being that, families have been here for generations, hundreds of generations, and spiritual health has been relied on and supported in that prenatal to 5 stage with our babies.
Our first premise is that if there's a public dollar going to a program, we want to understand what is happening in those classrooms. And that's a really important premise. It's about accountability, but it's deeper than that. From an equity perspective, we know that our public dollars support some of our most vulnerable kids and families. And so understanding what they're experiencing is really important, right? To support them to grow and to support them to support kids' learning and development. And so that's a really important shift to say we're going to be okay, as Virginia was, with a an optional measurement and improvement system to saying, now, if you receive a public dollar, we care about what those kids are experiencing, and we want to work with you to improve that. We in Virginia we've passed this law, right, that will require us to measure what's going on in all of these programs. We want to get to every classroom multiple times a year and to be able to track over time when kids get access to this experience, what happens. And so we've built what's called Link B5 here in the Commonwealth, which is a first of its kind of trying to both capture the full inventory of classrooms across all of these settings, to then get information about the educators and then to affiliate those quality indicators with those classrooms. We're now adding classroom lists so we can understand where kids are being served. And ultimately, we'll be able to connect that back to our kindergarten readiness results, which we're now capturing for 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds. But it will enable us to kind of understand not only what experiences are predictive of success, but actually to start to capture growth over time. The big challenge here is getting every single site and every single educator to enter data is no small feat, right? And that is huge. And you need that in order for this to be accurate and meaningful information. And so our communities in the Commonwealth, with the support of our research and technology partners, have slowly but surely done that, helping people understand. We made it a little easier by attaching an educator incentive to our quality measurement system. And so we piloted with an educator incentive that was for all of our early childhood sector teachers who work with publicly funded kids.
W. Deming said, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And right now in New Mexico, our prenatal to 5 system is not giving us the results that we know we want and that we know we can get. But it's going to take targeted investments, strong alignment, and the engagement of our communities, our families, and the providers who serve families. So that's what we're excited about.
This reorganization is not a quick, easy fix. It's a long-term play. We make these time investments now. They might not pay off for 15 or 20 years. But we know that someone has to do it, and we have to start now.
The one line I say, and I have to get it in here, is, and every time I present publicly, there is not a single provider or provider type in any state in this country or across our country who can serve all kids birth to 5, right? So we all have to come together to the table and say, we got to work together to do this, right? And that, I think, is such a important guiding principle, but it also forces you to think about this with some humility, right? And to kind of recognize that we're just going to do some of these things differently. But if we can agree on the most important things and support those, that's a key piece. We have to keep that true north in mind. It is a pain in the butt to move pieces of government. But if we keep that vision in mind, if we recognize that we are building maybe the most innovative systems out there, and we have this incredible upside in terms of kids' learning and development, I'm really excited about this. I'm also really excited because I think we can chart a path forward for early childhood educators that can be inclusive, right? That can recognize the different ways and the different competencies of adults that to sort of support our kids' learning and development. It doesn't have to be as binary as simply a teaching license.
There are a couple words of encouragement that I would pass on to others. One is to know that you're not alone. This is a bipartisan national issue where all of us are struggling at different, points of success, but all of us are struggling to figure it out. And there are some incredibly passionate people in every single legislature across the country, because I've met and worked with many of them. You don't know who's a Democrat, who's a Republican, who's a Libertarian. A lot of people focus on early childhood education, knowing together how important it is. The other point of encouragement I would make is that we don't have to study anything else. The studies have been done. They are clear, they are conclusive. So all we need to do is make sure we get the information to our friends and colleagues in our jurisdictions around the country and start making the case